So, something that urgently needs to be talked about is the trend of modern non dual teachers giving indiscriminate advice on trauma and unqualified advice on healing trauma to trauma victims seeking support. This is really unethical. What I've seen a lot lately is this inconsistency where certain non dual teachers on YouTube, for example, will say in one instance, in one video, that trauma healing really should be done with a psychotherapist and a trained trauma specialist. But then in other instances, or in some cases, several other videos, they are specifically addressing trauma victims, even advertising to them with the video titles and descriptions being about healing trauma, childhood trauma, abusive situations, all kinds of trauma, and giving advice on it. So there's what I see as this real inconsistent message or inconsistency in terms of explaining that trauma is not something that they're qualified to give advice on, and then doing that exact thing. And it's dangerous and often unethical for anyone to be giving unqualified blanket solution advice to trauma victims. But in the case of the modern either or non-dual teachings that are really focused on ego dissolution and destroying the sense of an individual separate sense of self, these are teachings that often can perpetuate trauma and spiritualize trauma responses with disembodying practices and teachings, dissociative teachings, perpetuating a lot of spiritual bypass. And of course, the heavy emphasis on destroying or seeing through the individual sense of self or denying entirely the validity of our individuality. Whereas if you do just a little bit of study into what's been researched into the causes of trauma, especially complex trauma that a lot of people come to non-dual teachings with, and I'm not just saying that as sort of a guess, but if you listen to a lot of the questioners or the people who come up to the microphone in a non-dual satsang, so many of the cases are people who are describing complex trauma and situations. And so it's really not hard to see that as the case. And so just as a quick example, people who've experienced complex trauma, which turns out to be quite a lot of people, in a lot of cases, were not able to differentiate or individuate themselves from others. And this has caused a lot of suffering and prevented a lot of people from kind of reaching these healthy developmental milestones where they're able to, tell the difference energetically between them and other people, being able to really be kind of the author of their own lives and have a strong, healthy sense of an individuated self, which so many of the non-dual teachings that are based on the idea that the solution to all suffering is to see through the illusion of the separate self and destroy a sense of individuality and personal boundaries. You can see how that can really be a strong disservice to these people. And you'll see, and if you're familiar with current non-dual, the popular mainstream non-dual teachings, that the advice and solutions given are often extremely oversimplified solutions to highly complex issues, especially here if we're talking about trauma. And messages that are often given to trauma victims are things like, reducing the trauma suffering to clinging to one's victimhood identity, which is can be a real shaming that can prevent people from speaking up and getting support from mental health professionals. Other types of things that are recommended or advised are dissolving everything into pure consciousness, as well as, let's say, dissolving all of your physical boundaries, destroying your ego completely. And again, often this ubiquitous message that knowing yourself as amorphous pure consciousness is the solution to all forms of suffering and a panacea, which is really a myth that needs to be seen through,
which often does not address underlying causes of suffering, which leads to very dangerous spiritual bypassing.
This is a topic for another conversation, but there's this associated really massive blind spot where this kind of ego dissolution is seen as the solution to suffering, but it's a huge blind spot in terms of the ways that ego dissolution paths and experiences actually lead to new forms of suffering for many people, even people who have, had, let's say, an abiding no self-awakening. It's true that expanded states of consciousness and awareness can be a tool for healing and working with trauma, but it's really something that ought to be done with a trained mental health professional. And one of the things just to kind of note is that in terms of these expanded states of consciousness and the boundlessness, and it's often taught in an imbalanced way, that often what is important for trauma victims who have experienced symptoms like disassociation and disembodiment, it's really important for there to be a balance of spaciousness and containment. And this is something that I needed to learn the hard way after many years.
An analogy that I'll give is that, let's say you're going to a meditation teacher who specializes in helping people learn how to meditate and deal with challenges with meditation practices. It's hard to imagine, going up to a microphone at a meditation workshop and saying, how could I apply meditation to healing my childhood trauma or getting out of an abusive relationship? You would not expect that teacher to be giving advice on that. You would expect them to say, I'm not qualified for that. I'm a meditation practice teacher. And so really, we need to be looking at the integrity of a teacher not being willing to say, this is what I'm qualified and this is what I'm not qualified for in a responsible way, and not giving advice on things that are beyond what their credentials and certifications and trainings are. And the sad truth is that this can sometimes be exploitation of people who are vulnerable and in crisis and an at-risk demographic, whether or not this is something that's conscious. But it can be, a way to draw in new followers, people who are obviously in deep distress and crisis and seeking, let's say, shortcuts to escape that immense immediate suffering, which was one of the things that drew me to non-duality in the first place.
Also a topic for another conversation, but I think part of this can tie into what seems to be apparent, that a lot of non-dual teachers are presenting themselves as an expert on everything. So you're kind of getting into the guru waters where they're kind of setting themselves up to be seen as an expert and an authority for all sources of suffering and issues in one's life, that they can come to this teacher for support with that. And some non-dual teachers may use this kind of idea of being unconventional or esoteric to kind of present themselves as renegades who hold exclusive wisdom that can be applied to all suffering. And that can also create a dangerous power dynamic where vulnerable people seek their advice, believing they have, all the answers, when in reality they often lack the necessary expertise. You may be somebody who's saying to yourself, well, hey, I found these non-dual teachings and ego dissolution to be really helpful for my trauma and for other people that I know, and that can be acknowledged, while also acknowledging that it's extremely dangerous to be giving unqualified trauma advice to thousands of people.
Ultimate message here is that if you're somebody who's experienced trauma and you're looking for support in healing it and navigating it, please seek the help of a qualified trauma-informed specialist and mental health professional rather than a non-dual teacher who does not have that as a specialty. And to look out for ourselves. Of course, we really do need to be holding non-dual teachers accountable because that's just not happening. And of course, that's a problem, but we also need to look out for ourselves and look out for each other. So, um, if this is something that concerns you as well, then please consider when you see non-dual teachers or let's say in YouTube videos giving unqualified advice on trauma to put something in the comments section to share quickly why this is dangerous. Also to friends who may be working with trauma healing that are relying on non-dual teachings that are very disembodied and disassociated and imbalanced. And also if you have friends or even teachers that you're involved with who are doing this to speak up about it. Um, and yeah, so I hope that people have found something helpful here.